Old school RuneScape is a game. A bank is a place that holds onto your stuff. I think that covers all the background info, so let's dive in. I am rating and critiquing RuneScape banks in the order they came into the game, and today we have a slight adjustment to our rating system from previous episodes. These banks will be rated on aesthetic, space, security/cleanliness, location, uniqueness, and finally a new category, bonus/extra considerations. Now, this last category will not be a score per se, but will be to add any bonus points or deductions of things not covered in previous categories. This, my friends, is the Ass Lube rating system. You win, people in the comments. You win. Our first bank that we are rating today is the Ynil Bank. It was the 14th bank to come into the game. It came into the game on October 10th, 2002. So let's dive right in and start with the aesthetic. Okay, let's cover the basics. Stone walls, checkered floor, 4 torches, and a brown rug that they clearly borrowed from Tutorial Island. A very average start, but let's dive a bit deeper. A huge open entrance covered by an awning, which I really like personally. Now, similar windows to that of Ardoin and Tutorial Island, which are still quite nice, and I want to make note of that. We have 1 table with 3 chairs and what appears to be a very nice little workstation. There's 1 leafy palm plant by the entrance. It's looking very healthy, and it honestly really helps pull the room together a bit. And finally, a sign hanging on the wall outside which displays nothing on one side, and on the other side also nothing. Now, were it not for that singular leafy palm and the wide open entrance with that nice thatched roof awning, I would say that this would be one of the more average aesthetics we've seen in a bank, but alas, I do think it deserves a bit more credit than that. I would have to rate the aesthetic of the Ynil Bank a 7.5. Now let's quickly transition to space. This bank feels quite big, so it is a bit of a surprise to realize that there are actually only 3 bankers in this bank. With 3 empty booths and 2 tables running along the bank counter, it feels odd to have all 3 bankers within 4 tiles of each other. That seems like a very odd choice of space. There is so much more space behind the bank counter, yet it feels very cramped and clumped together in the middle. And yet again, we have a total of 5 desks and tables in this bank. That feels appropriate for the bank size, but not the amount of staff working the bank. Now that said, I'm quite fond of this little work area here, and the pull booth and deposit box really don't feel like they crowd the space in here at all. This space is utilized just decent enough for me here to give it a 7.1. Okay, safety and cleanliness. It seems very clean and tidy here. Almost suspiciously so, might I say. This is a decently trafficked bank, so with only 3 staff, I'm honestly surprised to see it so clean. I mean, no dust, no debris at all, which almost leads me to believe that maybe I just came on a day when they were a bit short-staffed. A definite and real possibility. Now, it is very clean though, okay, and I want to make that point very candidly and clear, and I believe very secure as well, although I don't see a place where patrons' items are secured. Now, one final note regarding the safety and perhaps security of this bank, a rather small note might I add, but I definitely think it's worth saying. About 10 steps from this bank, there are 3 cages where they keep prisoners, a tramp who appears to be the one in charge of this area, and a noose where I can only assume they publicly execute the prisoners. Now, I wasn't quite sure what category this fell under, but considering that blood must get tracked through this bank from time to time, and how unruly bloodthirsty mobs can be, I think that this category is more than appropriate to put this little detail. I'm just gonna say, a 5.0? I mean, Jesus Christ, I don't know. I'm gonna say 5.0. All right, now let's move on to the location. I've always liked the layout of Ynil. It really reminds me of those small, more rural towns with one main street, right? You take one road and see practically every building in town. That really is what Ynil reminds me of. This bank is located at the far west part of town, and it's a sort of endpoint to the town. And it's a bit hard to explain, and I'm trying to articulate it as best I can, but I really like this location in terms of where it is in the town. My POH, my house, is in Ynil, and I placed it there for a reason. My trips to the bank from my house are lovely. It is a leisurely stroll where I pass by and wave to my friends in town. I check on my crops, I pick some wheat, and I even buy a crate of rotten tomatoes from Pelter's Veg Stall to throw at those filthy fucking prisoners. This is a quaint and simple bank that was thoughtfully located. 8.3. Now moving on to our final category, uniqueness, and I will be rather terse here. What exactly is unique about this bank? Well, we have the sign that says nothing, the awning covered entryway, and honestly, that's kind of it. I mean, please leave a comment if I'm missing something here. I have looked this bank over for probably multiple hours at this point. Nothing is jumping off the page to me other than these two things that I pointed out. I think with the bank itself, there really isn't anything unique about it. This is not a unique bank. It just isn't. 3.9. Are there bonus points to be awarded or any extra considerations to take into account here? No, there are not. Very simply, there are none. Well, ladies and squirrels, the scores have been tallied. We average them out and we come to a score of 6.4 for the Bank of Yanil. If this is your favorite bank, it probably shouldn't be. I'll just leave it at that. And we swiftly transition to the 15th bank to come into the game. This came into the game on December 12th, 2002. We are talking about the Gnome Stronghold South Bank. Now let's begin with the aesthetic, and wow, okay. 2 entrances to this bank. Coming from the south, you are immediately greeted by 3 lovely flower pots with a stool and a bench. And now weather dependent, but on a nice day, this must be an incredibly pleasing place to wait or fill out paperwork. I'm very, very keen on this area and the aesthetic of this area. No other waiting area I've seen in any other bank thus far comes close aesthetically, in my opinion. Now, entering this bank from the north, we have a very similar aesthetic, this time with a pole booth replacing one of the potted plants. This bank is also lined entirely with wood and cream-colored rope, and aesthetically it looks nice and really just makes obvious sense with the gnome style. Now, moving to the center of this bank, we have 4 gnome bankers, all of whom look completely dead inside, and despite their well-dressed top, they are wearing atrocious high-waisted green pants with awful vomit-colored shoes. The counters, however, are quite nice, and I think the lack of symmetry between the 2 sides actually works for this bank. I also love our potted palms here. However, I don't love the bug-infested lamp in terms of aesthetic. However, the crown jewel of this bank really is the center area and how it is covered by this massive shady tree with branches and leaves just draping over the entire center of this bank. The natural aesthetic that surrounds you, it really is terrific here. So for the bank aesthetic, I would have to rate it a 9.0. Now in terms of space, the space here is limited to its one almost hallway-like architecture, but each area is spaced very well due to these essentially bridges between the 3 areas. It really does make this space feel much larger, and I also appreciate that with the narrow space given, so much of it was utilized to enhance the aesthetic. I think that's incredibly important. Really, everything about the space of this bank just makes sense, even if the actual space and square footage feels a bit limited. I would have to rate the space here an 8.8. Now moving on to safety and cleanliness. Now outside of the 4 gnome bankers, you'll notice 2 other gnomes wandering this bank. We have 1, a gnome guard, and 2, a man named Guard Vimeldo. Now we can only attack the gnome guards, so can't really understand their deal, but Vimeldo is clearly keeping this bank safe and monitoring for any sketchy behavior. Even examining him, we notice that he looks alert and ready. I must say, I feel incredibly safe in this bank, and I would feel safe securing my items in this bank. Now, to be fair, we must note the gaping hole in the floor where the tree is coming out of. This surely could have been filled in a bit to ensure that there was no accidents related to this. As for cleanliness, for being a bank that's outdoors, I must say it is incredibly tidy in here. We are unable to kind of observe what the quality of the wood is, perhaps due to weathering, but it seems to be very well maintained. I would give this bank safety and cleanliness an 8.7. Now location, I spent quite a lot of time meditating and thinking about this, and I don't want to focus on the location of the Tree Gnome stronghold as much as I do the location of the bank within the stronghold. This bank is frequented by adventurers on farm runs and on slayer tasks with its close proximity to Neve and the Slayer Cave. And this unfortunately lends this bank to be more of a utility bank as opposed to a destination bank. It's very useful, but with its usefulness comes high traffic volume, comes movement, comes busyness. Now these are not inherently bad things on their own. Banks are here after all to provide a service, right? But they also serve as a resting place, a gathering place, an area with comfortable familiarity, and a bank with such a pleasant aesthetic would just do much better in my opinion in an area completely divorced from its utility. Now to just be crystal clear and candid on this, the location is not bad, but instead I suppose it's rather disappointing. It reminds me of like a wonderful quaint coffee shop that out of nowhere becomes trendy, and so for that reason I would have to give the location of the Gnome Stronghold South Bank a 6.8. Now finally, this brings us to the uniqueness. The uniqueness of this bank, it's really derived not from its most intimate details, but from a more macro level. It's a bank held up by trees and covered by a big ass tree in the middle. That, in and of itself, is very unique. We've touched on a few other aspects already that uniquely define this bank as well, which bolster the score, in my opinion, to a very fair 8.2. Now quickly, let's touch on the bonus or extra considerations for this bank. The attentiveness of the guard here is truly remarkable, and it's quietly my favorite thing about this bank. But just as I wanted to give a bonus point or two for this, I decided it was really evened out by how unbelievably unattentive these bankers are. Don't let the shirts fool you. These are some of the worst bankers I've seen yet. I mean, look at this. So for that, no bonus points or extra considerations here. After looking at our scores and averaging them out, this brings the Gnome Stronghold South Bank to an average score of 8.3. 8.3, a very, very pleasant bank, and to be honest, I wasn't expecting it to be such a pleasant bank. Now coming to our last bank of the day, the 16th bank to come into the game. It came into the game on the same day as the Gnome Stronghold South Bank, on December the 12th, 2002. We are traveling just a little bit north to the Gnome Stronghold North Bank. All right, now let's begin with the aesthetic. This obviously has a lot of similarities to the South Bank, most of which I do really like. The tree coverage, the rope lining on the walkways, the banker's lifeless eyes, which I guess I actually am not a huge fan of, but there are key differences in the aesthetic. The bank is actually sectioned off into two parts. To the south, we have 3 stalls, 2 bankers, who seem relatively attentive, yet cramped next to the tree coming through the ground. A few bug-infested lamps, and that's really it for this area. Then we move a bit west to another area, and we have an area with, again, 3 stalls and 2 bankers, but this time one of the bankers is doing all the work while the other contemplates ending it all. Now, they are way too cramped, but this time by a desk, 2 lamps, and a rather nice yet somewhat strangely placed palm leaf plant. Now I must say I don't really love the aesthetic of either of these areas. Now these 2 areas are connected by one central area, and that has a leafless, possibly dying tree in the middle, a loot chest, a pole booth, 1 palm plant, which I actually do like here, and gnomes and gnome women. And hey, you know what, real quick, outside of this bank score, why do men gnomes get to just be called gnomes while women gnomes have to be called gnome women? The fuck's up with that? What's going on there? The aesthetic here is, I mean, average, bordering on bad, might I say? Feels harsh, but I would have to give the aesthetic of this bank a 6.0. Now moving on to space, frankly, I just don't love how the space in this bank is utilized. It's behind the bankers in the center area. Everything's cramped and positioned without any clear thought or direction. Now, but I want to be fair, a positive here is definitely from my observations, the south area receives much, much higher traffic volumes than does the west area. And this does allow adventurers to access the utility of this bank, or should they desire a quieter, more reserved area. With all this being said, I would rate the space of this bank a 7.6. All right, moving on to safety and cleanliness. Is this bank clean? I mean, it appears so, or at least comparable to the South Bank. Is it safe? I mean, it doesn't inherently seem dangerous, but also not necessarily overly safe either. It's a bit difficult to say. Now this bank is within the Grand Tree, which feels like the safest area in the stronghold, so I do suppose it's maybe more safe than other areas, but who knows what this banker's going to do? I mean, I get real bad vibes from him. However, I'm going to try to set my judgments of this banker aside, and I'm going to try to cast a fair score here. I think it deserves an 8.1 for safety and cleanliness. All right, the penultimate category for this bank, location. I actually am pretty partial to the location of this bank. Just to the north, you can head over to the Gnome Kitchen if you get hungry. You know, toad crunchies make for a great bank standing snack. And to the east, you have a bustling bar with exotic cocktails. And finally, you know, from the bank itself, you actually get quite a nice view. You're able to kind of look upon much of the stronghold, which is really rather pleasant. I would have to rate the location of this bank a very nice 8.9, a surprisingly well-located bank. Now, finally, uniqueness. Again, this bank is in a fucking tree. That's unique. 2 separate banking areas, also unique. But to be critical, it's just missing that something special that I feel this bank had the potential for. It's unique, but strangely, it just doesn't feel like it. It's difficult to articulate, but I stand on my analysis here. I just don't think there's anything particularly unique that maybe pushes this over the edge in conjunction with the rest of the features of this bank. I would have to give this a 7.2 for uniqueness. As far as I can tell, we have no bonus points to award or extra considerations to take into account here. So for our final bank of the day, the Gnome Stronghold North Bank, we average our scores and it comes out to a rating of 7.6. All right, there's this week's bank critiques. Thank you so much for watching, and please leave a comment telling me what I got right and wrong, okay? I am not perfect, I admit that, but these banks need to be held to a high standard, so dialogue around this is always, always, always appreciated. I love you very much, and I will see you next time.